There was no warning, no announcement beyond the sterile voice over the loudspeaker. Immediately go to the nearest room and lock and barricade the door. Stay low and stay quiet. But what followed felt less like a drill and more like the beginning of something rotten clawing its way to the surface. And in that cramped, dimly lit hallway of the old rural high school where the bricks always felt a little too cold and the windows never quite let in enough light, a shadow moved, slow and deliberate, slipping past classrooms where teachers whispered reassurances they didn't believe and students crouched under desks with wide, unblinking eyes. Nobody knew then that the thing stalking those halls had been born not from outside threats, but from the whispered cruelty we all dismissed, jokes muttered behind backs, laughter at someone else's silence, the daily slow erosion of a soul no one noticed until it began to rot. Luke, the quiet boy, the forgotten one, had stopped coming to class weeks ago, and while some thought he'd transferred or dropped out, others whispered of the masked figure seen once at twilight on the security cams, standing by the second floor stairwell with a duffel bag in one hand and a gaze fixed beyond the lens. That day, with the doors locked and the school trapped in a collective breath, the fire alarm suddenly screamed. Not from smoke, but from a blade jammed into the pull station near the gym, and the lights flickered like something was laughing in Morse code, and when Mrs. Jennings tried to call for help, the line went dead, replaced by a low static hum, and then, God help us, the faint sound of distorted children's laughter, like it had been recorded underwater. No one knew how Luke had re-entered the building or why the surveillance cameras had gone dark hours before. But we all felt him, somehow, moving just beyond the walls, his quiet resentment now transformed into something ancient and echoing, like the school itself had absorbed his loneliness and decided to speak on his behalf. And when the power finally died and the sun dipped low enough that the windows reflected nothing but the classroom's dim silhouette, we saw writing appear slowly on the inside of the glass in dripping black streaks. Do you see me now? And one by one, students began to cry silent tears, not from fear of death, but from the dawning horror that maybe they had helped make this, that cruelty, like mold, only needs darkness and time to grow. And in that long night, as footsteps echoed endlessly in the halls and the air grew too cold to be natural, I kept my eyes on the door handle, watching it twitch like a pulse, and I prayed that whatever Luke had become wouldn't remember the one ride home, the one act of kindness, because I no longer knew if that memory would save me or damn me with the rest up misses. Chun sighed, got up, and locked the door like it was just another inconvenience in her day, telling everyone to move to the corner of the room farthest from the door and window. And for a while, it really did feel like another routine drill, the kind we all silently groaned through, until we heard the first noise, faint but sharp, like metal scraping against tile coming from somewhere down the hall. And that's when a mood shifted in the room as the fake sense of security drained from our faces, and even Mrs. Chen's posture stiffened. No one said anything, but we all heard it, and the silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own breathing sounding too loud in my ears. And then there was another sound, closer this time, heavier, more distinct, like dragging, slow, deliberate, methodical, echoing in the corridor. Someone near me whispered, "What is that?" But no one answered because no one knew. And then came the worst part, the moment the classroom doorknob jiggled. Once paused, and then started turning slowly, deliberately, like someone testing each locked door one by one. And I swear to God the air in the room went cold, like the heat had been sucked out. And I saw Mrs. Chun mouthing something, maybe a prayer, maybe a command to stay still, but none of us could move anyway, our bodies frozen with fear. And then the rattling stopped and footsteps moved on, the heavy dragging sound retreating, fading for a moment until we thought maybe, just maybe, whoever, it was gone. But then came a knock, slow and steady, on the classroom window behind us. And we all turned in sync to see a figure standing there, tall, masked, holding something long and dark in one hand and dragging something behind him with the other. And even though the blinds were mostly closed, we could see the shape clearly outlined against the weak light outside, just standing there, motionless now, like he was watching us through the tiny gap. And one of the girls next to me began crying quietly into her sleeve as another knock came, louder this time, followed by the scraping sound again, this time on the glass. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the figure stepped back and disappeared from view. No footsteps, no dragging, just gone. And we sat in that dark silence for what felt like eternity, flinching at every creak and shadow, until finally the principal's voice came over the speaker, shaky and brief, saying, "Remain in lockdown. Authorities are on site," and we realized this was real. This wasn't a prank or a drill, and that realization made everything feel worse because it meant someone dangerous was inside the building with us, and the only thing between us and him was a locked door and some desks pushed against it, and time lost all meaning after that. We didn't know how long we waited, only that eventually we heard shouting, running, doors opening, and then police voices yelling for people to stay down and not move. And eventually, finally, they opened our door and told us to evacuate with our hands visible and not to look around. And when I stepped into the hallway, I immediately wished I hadn't because the floor was smeared with dark red trails leading from one classroom to another, and the walls had streaks that looked like someone had tried to claw at them. And I saw a door across from us hanging open with a broken lock. And an officer quickly pulled me away and told me not to look, but I saw just enough to know someone hadn't made it, that this day was going to stain every part of my memory from now on. And though they never told us exactly who the man was or how he got inside, rumors spread fast about a former student expelled years ago, or a man who had been stalking the school's back fence for months. And some even said the dragging sound was a body, or worse, something alive he was bringing with him. But all I know is that after that day, Earth Science was moved to a different room. The windows in our school were all replaced with shatterproof glass, and I never sat near one again. And sometimes at night, I still hear the knock, slow, steady, like it's coming back for a second try. After that day, nothing felt normal again. Not really, even though they tried to make it seem like everything was under control. The school brought in counselors, the local news moved on, and eventually, they even started letting us back into the East Wing, though most of us avoided it like it was cursed because we knew something had happened there that couldn't be erased with fresh paint or a new security camera. And even though the teachers avoided talking about it, we all remembered the blood on the floors, the strange dragging noise, the mass figure of the window, and how when the police finally released a report, it said unknown individual, no name, no motive, just that the suspect had vanished without a trace, and that part, vanished, is what kept so many of us awake at night, because how does someone just disappear inside a locked school full of police and cameras? Unless they were never meant to be caught in the first place. And that's when the rumors started getting weirder, not just kids whispering in the lunchroom, but teachers too, speaking in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening, about how the janitor quit the day after, refusing to ever step foot in the building again, or how one of the officers from the lockdown day hadn't returned to duty since, claiming he saw something wrong in the reflection of a glass door, something that didn't match what was on the other side. And by the time Halloween came around, someone had already put up a fake crime scene outside the East Wing with red paint and a plastic mask taped to the window. But the principal had it all torn down before first period, and we got an announcement over the speaker saying anyone caught making light of tragic events would be expelled immediately, which only made it more obvious how shaken the staff still were. I tried to forget, I really did, but then strange things started happening again. Subtle at first, like doors locking on their own, lights flickering in empty hallways, or the fire alarm going off with no smoke or heat, always around the same time of day. 2:17 p.m., the exact minute the lockdown had started last spring. I wouldn't have thought much of it if it had been just me noticing, but others did too, like Sarah, who swore she saw the same mask behind the gym's exit door, or Jamal, who said he heard the dragging sound again while alone in the band room. And though the faculty brushed it off as stress or imagination, something about the way they avoided our eyes made it clear they were scared too. And then one Thursday, exactly 1 year later, Mrs. Chun didn't show up for class. No email, no sub, just an empty desk and a half-finished cup of tea still warm when we found it. And someone pointed out that her seat faced the window, the same one from last year, and there, etched into glass, so faintly you had to lean in close to see it, was a single word, written backward from the outside. Remember, and I swear to you, none of us touched it. None of us could even breathe as we stared at that word. And then the intercom clicked on with a loud burst of static followed by a knock. Not from the door, but from the speaker itself. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and then silence, and we all stood there, frozen again like we were back in that first lockdown, except this time, no one came to open the door, no police arrived. No voice told us to remain calm. And for the first time since last year, I realized the thing that had come into our school hadn't left at all. It had just been waiting, watching, choosing the next moment to remind us that some doors, once opened, never really close. After that day with Mrs. Chin's disappearance and the word remember etched into the glass, the school changed. Not officially, not in any way that made the news or got talked about at PDA meetings, but in the air, in the way the hallways seemed darker even during daylight, in the way teachers started avoiding staying after school alone, and how even the janitors began working in pairs, whispering to each other in Spanish when they passed certain doors, and while the administration tried harder than ever to maintain order. New rules, stricter security, even occasional unannounced lockdown drills. The truth was, none of it mattered because whatever had wormed its way into our building wasn't afraid of alarms or metal detectors. It lived in the cracks, in the silence between class bells, in the distorted reflections in trophy cases and the shifting shadows under the auditorium seats. And the more we tried to ignore it, the more it made itself known, like how the clocks on the east side of the school all started slowing down at the same time each day, or how the photos in the yearbook office began changing. People who had died or disappeared were now missing from the group shots they'd once clearly been in, their absence so seamless that if you hadn't remembered them, you'd never even know they'd existed. And then there were the dreams, or maybe they weren't dreams. Maybe they were something closer to visits, shared experiences that a few of us started having, where we'd wake up with the same images in our heads. A long corridor with no end, a red door pulsing like a heartbeat, and that same mask from the lockdown floating in the dark, just beyond reach. And it all came to a head the night of the senior lock-in, which we all begged the school to cancel, but they refused, insisting it would be good for morale. So we went, not because we wanted to, but because we needed to see if the thing would show itself again. And of course it did, just not how we expected. First the lights started cutting out, row by row, like something was walking across the ceiling and snuffing them out with each step. And then someone screamed from the art room, and when we ran to check, we found every canvas turned to the wall except one. And on that one was a painting. None of us remembered anyone making a perfect, detailed image of the school hallway with all of us standing in it. Except our faces were gone, just blank, smooth skin where eyes and mouth should be. And the worst part was that the painting showed a figure behind us, tall, wrong, wearing that same mask, hand outstretched toward the back of my neck. And before we could even say a word, the fire alarm started again, blaring and flickering and echoing, and everyone scattered, trying to find exits. That suddenly led to nowhere. Staircases looping back on themselves, doors opening into brick walls, and I remember running, screaming, slamming my fists against a window that should have led to the parking lot, but instead looked out into an infinite black void, like the world had folded in on itself, and then silence again, complete, suffocating silence, until I woke up in the nurse's office with no memory of how I got there. The lights too bright, the halls empty, and no one around except a note taped to my chest in handwriting I recognized as my own, though I didn't write it, saying, "You open the door, now you have to walk through it." And when I stumbled outside, the sun was rising, the lock-in was over, and no one remembered anything. Not the screams, not the painting, not the black void, but I did. And the worst part is I think that was the point, because now it's inside me too, waiting, watching, whispering things I shouldn't understand in a voice I thought I'd forgotten. And every time I close my eyes, I see that corridor, that door, that mask, and I know it's not over, not even close. After the lock-in, I stopped going to school, not officially at first. I still got up each morning, got dressed, walked out the door with my backpack slung over one shoulder so my parents wouldn't suspect anything. But instead of heading to class, I wandered through empty parks, down side streets, through libraries where I searched for books that might explain what was happening to me. To all of us, books on folklore and demonology, shadow people, mass hallucinations, anything that might give shape to the thing that followed me in every reflection. But nothing matched exactly, and that made it worse, like it didn't belong to any known category, like it was older than names, deeper than myth, and every night the dreams got stronger. Not just glimpses anymore, but full experiences, Hours spent in that endless hallway beneath the school. The red door always closer, but never reachable. The mask now floating just over my shoulder, whispering things I could never remember when I woke. Except for one word it repeated again and again. Soon. And then one afternoon, I passed by the school, meaning only to keep walking, but I stopped when I saw that someone had spray painted something huge across the front windows. Letters so tall they reached the second floor, jagged, frantic strokes that read, "Don't let him out." And I just stood there, frozen, while cars drove past and nobody else even seemed to notice it. Like the words were only meant for me. And when I finally turned away, heart pounding, I realized something worse. There was someone in the window watching me. Someone wearing a black hoodie and a mask identical to the one from the lockdown. Only this time, the eyes were glowing faintly red, and when I blinked, they were gone, the glass just reflecting the sky. And that night, my phone buzzed at 3:13 a.m. with a video I didn't remember recording. It was me standing at the end of a hallway, motionless, staring directly into the camera with that same expressionless mask over my face, and behind me, barely visible in the darkness, the door, no longer red, but open, just a sliver, and something moving inside it, something wrong. And from that moment on, it wasn't just dreams or visions anymore. It started affecting the real world. Mirrors cracking without reason when I passed, light bulbs flickering out one by one in my house until I was left in near constant darkness. And the people around me began to act strange, like they were being watched through me. Like I was a window now, not a person, and I didn't know how to stop it. Only that each time I ignored the pull, the hallway appeared somewhere else. Once behind a freezer door in my kitchen, once in the back seat mirror of an Uber, once inside the screen of a turned-off television. Always the same corridor, always that door waiting for me. And I knew then with a kind of sick certainty that I was no longer being haunted. I was being prepared, hollowed out piece by piece to become something else. Something that would eventually open the door not just in dreams, but in the waking world. And when that happened, I don't think it would stay inside me. I think it would spread that I stopped sleeping entirely after that, not out of choice but fear, because every time I closed my eyes, I felt myself slipping, not just dreaming anymore, but being drawn somewhere like gravity pulling at my bones. And even when I tried to stay awake, coffee, pills, walking for hours until my legs ached, it didn't matter. I'd blink too long, and suddenly I'd be there again, in that corridor, only now it wasn't empty. Now it pulsed with a low hum like distant machinery, and the walls bled rust-colored stains that moved like veins. And I'd hear the breathing, not mine, slow and wet and heavy, and it was always behind me, always just a second away if I dared to turn around, but I never did because some instinct told me that seeing it would make it real, would finish something that had already begun. And in the waking world, things were unraveling faster. My parents stopped speaking in full sentences. They'd stare through me at dinner with glassy eyes and mouths half open like they were listening to something else entirely. The neighbors began to leave notes on our door written in strange looping symbols I couldn't read, but somehow understood. Warnings, maybe, or invitations, I wasn't sure, and every screen in the house, TV, phone, laptop, started glitching, not static, but images of the hallway, sometimes. Just a single frame, sometimes flickering in and out like a heartbeat. And one night, I caught my own reflection, mouthing words I wasn't saying, words I didn't know, but somehow felt ancient, as if they'd always been waiting for someone to say them again. And when I tried to film it, the video file corrupted instantly, leaving behind a single audio track of whispering voices layered over what sounded like distant screaming and wet dragging footsteps. And by then I was no longer alone in my body. I could feel it, him pressing up from inside my skin like a second self, breathing when I didn't breathe, blinking when I didn't blink. And I realized with a kind of nauseating clarity that I was no longer trying to escape the hallway. I was becoming it, carrying it with me, a vessel or a passage, or maybe just a door disguised as a person. And each time someone looked me in the eyes too long, they flinched, like they saw something moving behind them. And I knew it was only a matter of time before whatever was waiting behind that red door, whatever had chosen me, would use me to step through, not quietly, not subtly, but like a scream tearing through the fabric of the world. And there would be no more dreams then, only corridors. The thing inside me was getting stronger, more restless, and I could feel it clawing, trying to break free, a thing that had been coiled up in the dark spaces of my mind. patiently waiting for the right moment to stretch out and unfold. I didn't sleep anymore. Not that it mattered, because even when my body was awake, my mind wasn't. It wandered through the hallway now. Or perhaps it was me wandering. I couldn't tell anymore. Time bent strangely, hours blending into one another, as if the world outside had become a distant echo, unreachable, fading. I'd see people on the street, faces I thought I knew, but when I looked too hard, they weren't quite right. Their eyes were too wide, too empty, like they had already seen what I'd seen or would see soon, and they avoided looking at me, always glancing over their shoulders, like there was something hunting them too. And the whispers grew louder, voices overlapping in my thoughts, a murmur that was almost a chant now, their words too fragmented for me to understand, but each one felt like a weight, pushing me further down into something darker. Every corner I turned, every street I walked down, there was a sense of something closing in on me, something that had always been there, waiting for the moment when I couldn't run anymore. I tried to reach out for help, but the words stuck in my throat, a knot that wouldn't let go, because I knew that whatever was happening to me wasn't something anyone could fix. My family had already started to fade, disappearing in bits and pieces like they were being erased from the edges of my life. My mother's voice, soft, distant, was just a memory now, and my father, once so grounded and steady, had become a shadow, barely there, his face too thin, eyes too dark, as if he was seeing something else, something behind me. Then one evening, I found myself standing in front of the red door again. It had always been there, but I never wanted to open it, not fully, not while it was still locked away. But now I could hear it, faintly at first, a scratching sound from the other side like claws against wood, a rhythmic tapping that called to me. The door wasn't locked anymore, and when I reached out to touch it, it felt cold, impossibly cold, as though it had been waiting for me, just like everything else. My hand lingered for a moment, a hesitation, but I knew what would happen if I didn't open it. I wasn't just unlocking a door, I was unlocking myself, and the thought hit me like a gut punch. There would be no turning back this time. As the door creaked open, the air inside felt heavier, thicker, pressing against my chest, and I stepped forward into the darkness, ready or not. As I crossed the threshold of the door, the world around me seemed to fold in on itself, warping into something I couldn't fully comprehend. The darkness was alive, pulsating with a thick, wet heat that seemed to breathe in time with my own heartbeat. My legs trembled, yet I kept walking forward, unable to stop myself, as if some unseen force was guiding me, pushing me deeper into the heart of whatever lay behind that door. I could hear the sounds now, louder, more distinct. Whispers, murmurs, low groans that seemed to come from all directions. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were real, crawling through the air, slipping under my skin. And as I moved further into the shadows, I could feel the walls closing in around me. The space stretched endlessly, though it shouldn't have. It was like I had stepped into a place that defied every law of reality, a space where time had no meaning, where nothing made sense. The only thing that seemed certain was the presence that followed me, a thing that could be nothing else but the thing that had been inside me all this time, the thing I had been running from without even knowing it. And as I reached the center of the darkened space, it was there, waiting, coiled in the corners of my mind like a serpent, its eyes glowing with a hunger that was as old as the darkness itself. It spoke to me, its voice low and guttural, a sound like rustling leaves, but it was clear, unmistakable. "You should have stayed away," it said, and I felt those words sink into my skin like a poison. But there was no turning back. I had walked into its lair willingly, after all. The room began to pulse now, the walls vibrating, a deep hum that resonated through every bone in my body, and I realized, too late, that I wasn't alone. There were others, faces in the dark, watching me, their eyes gleaming with that same hollow emptiness I had seen in the street. They were standing in the shadows, motionless, but their gaze followed every step I took, and I understood then, this wasn't a place meant for the living. I wasn't meant to be here, not anymore, and yet I couldn't leave. There was no way back. I tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come out, choked by the very air around me. My chest tightened, my throat closed, and as I gasped for breath, I felt the thing inside me surge forward, clawing its way out, taking control. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the door, slowly closing behind me, its edges creaking with finality. It had locked me in as I opened my eyes. I found myself in a new place, though it was no less suffocating. The air was thick, heavier than before, pressing against my lungs, making it hard to breathe. My body felt different, as though it no longer belonged to me, as though it had been reshaped, remade in some twisted, darkened corner of this unholy place. I could hear whispers again, only this time they weren't just around me. They were inside me, scratching at the edges of my thoughts, urging me to listen, to understand. But there was nothing to understand, nothing that made sense. All I knew was the presence, that terrible, suffocating presence that was still there, lurking in the dark corners of my mind, pulling the strings of my actions, dictating every movement, every breath. My fingers twitched involuntarily, the sensation of something crawling just beneath my skin making my stomach turn. I could feel it, something cold, slick, moving just under my flesh. And I knew, without question, that I was no longer fully human. The room around me was a grotesque parody of a place that had once been familiar. Furniture overturned, cracked windows with no light shining through, walls that seemed to be bleeding, their surface pulsing like veins. It was as though the world itself was dying, and I was its last witness. And then I saw them, shadows, figures that flickered in and out of existence, shapes that hovered just beyond my reach, their outlines shifting with a fluidity that made my head spin. They were waiting, watching, just as they had been before. Only now their faces were clearer, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just shadows. They were people I had once known, people I had loved and lost, each of them standing in stillness, their eyes vacant, their mouths open in silent screams. The words came then, whispered so softly I thought I might have imagined them, but no, they were clear. "You should never have opened the door," one of them said. It was my mother, her voice hollow, distant like an echo from the past, but filled with a deep, impossible sadness. And I understood what they meant then, what all meant. The door had been the beginning of everything, the beginning of my descent, of my undoing. Once I stepped inside, I sealed my fate, and now there was no escape. My mind reeled, fighting to grasp onto something, anything that might pull me out of this nightmare, but nothing made sense anymore. Every thought was clouded. Every action was not my own, and as I moved deeper into this hellish place, I realized with sickening certainty that I was already lost. There was no way back, no redemption. I was trapped, a prisoner of my own choices. The shadows closed in tighter around me, their cold, hollow gazes never leaving, and I knew then that this was only the beginning. The door, the one I had foolishly opened, was only the threshold. What lay beyond was far worse than I could ever imagine. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, a cacophony of voices clawing at my mind, telling me things I couldn't comprehend but felt deep within my bones. Each voice was a thread in the web I had trapped myself in, and with every moment that passed, the threads tightened, drawing me deeper into the darkness. The air became thick with the scent of decay, of rot, and I could feel it seeping into my skin, my flesh. I was becoming one with this place, no longer separate from it. The figures, my family, my friends, remained fixed in place, their eyes following me as I stumbled forward, each step heavier than the last, my body no longer responding the way it once had. The air around me grew colder, my breath visible as frost formed on the walls, creeping like ice over every surface. I could see it now, the truth I had been too afraid to acknowledge. The door wasn't just a passage to this nightmare. It was the gate to something older, something darker. It had been waiting for me, calling me, whispering promises of power, of escape, of freedom. But it was all lies. This was never about freedom. It was about control. It was about being consumed, body and soul, by whatever dark force had crafted this place. I tried to scream, to fight, but my voice was swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence that had descended over the room. The shadows shifted again, moving closer, their forms blurring as they merged into one, a single, monstrous presence that towered over me. It had no face, no features, just an endless void that seemed to stretch into infinity. And then, finally, it spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that rumbled through my chest. You have come far, but it is not enough. You sought knowledge, but you did not seek truth. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in place, as the darkness closed in around me, its cold tendrils curling around my wrists, my ankles pulling me into its embrace. You wanted to know what was on the other side. The voice continued, its tone filled with a twisted satisfaction. Now you know, but the price is more than you can bear. I could feel the weight of its words sinking into my mind, drowning out all other thoughts, all other fears. The darkness was no longer just around me. It was inside me, twisting its way into my soul, consuming what little of me was left. And in that moment, I understood. There was no escape, no redemption. The door had been the beginning, yes, but it was also the end. I was never meant to leave. The door was not a way out, but a way in, and once I had crossed its threshold, I had sealed my fate. I could feel myself slipping away, my mind unraveling, my identity dissolving into the void. And as I finally surrendered to the darkness, I heard one last whisper, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Welcome home. The world around me faded into nothingness, and I was lost, consumed by the very force I had tried so desperately to understand. And so, I remained forever trapped, forever lost in the place between worlds.